So the thoughts I want to share with you today aren't so much about the future environment. Everyone else has been talking about that, and I think that's fantastic, and people know a lot more about that. What I want to do is go introspective, look inside the Postal Service, the postal organisation. You can't get more insular than that. And, I don't think you expect anything else from an old postal manager than, going inside the nuts and bolts of the operation. And if you want to have an idea about how things should change, you've got to know where you stand today. In honour of St Patrick's Day just past, one of my favourite Irish stories is a visitor was asked a local farmer for directions to a tourist attraction, and the farmer said, "To get there, I wouldn't be starting from here." And if you think about it, if you think about where you're standing today in whatever postal business, but in particular the audience here is mainly interested in the USPS, you have to sort of think about where you're starting now before you can fantasise about where you can go. I've seen a lot of postal businesses in my working life. I always have an opinion about what I think of them, how good they are, what the prospects are, and so on. I always keep those opinions to myself. But what I thought I'd share with you today is the rating system I use to think about a postal business. It's all about measurement, it's all about benchmarking, and it's about optimisation. Measurement, because we want to talk about progress and relevance. We need to know where we are, where we need to go, and we have to measure the right things to convince the stakeholders. We have to benchmark because we're global citizens, so even though we have our national characteristics and so on, what are other people doing? Are they relevant to us? How do we perform? And it's an optimisation game, not a maximisation one, because the uniqueness and history of the postal sector means we have to recognise the external influences, whether they're community or political or whatever. And so there's trade-offs that we have to follow. We could increase productivity, but is there an expense against service? And then that has other implications. So how do you optimise those paths? So it's all mathematical as far as I'm concerned, so pretty easy. And so I want to start scoring now. So I've got 5 measures where I think a postal business is today. 1, governance. 2, productivity. 3, regulation. 4th, diversification. And 5th, the commercial metrics. And I'm going to say a few words on each of those just very quickly. I think governance is the most critical. It means how the demands and needs of the stakeholders are met or interpreted, how they're managed, how the organisation responds to those. In some ways, I think it's even more important debate than thinking about privatisation and thinking about ownership. The governance structure, the mandate that's given to the governors, I think is very important. But, governance is carried out by people. And so, the calibre, the breadth, the experience, the independence, the wisdom, the emotional intelligence of people you put on a board, a postal board, has to be thought about. It's probably why so many old people are on boards. So how do we rate the Postal Service on the question of governance? Well, you're supposed to laugh at this point. We don't have a board of governors at the moment. And if we even set that aside, and if we think about ultimately there will be a board, of course, if we jump from the United States to the next country whereby a board is almost completely politically oriented or selected, then I think you jump a surprisingly long way to find another country like that. So my second list was productivity. That sounds pretty simple. As far as I'm concerned, it's how many letters and parcels are sorted for a given input of labour and capital. It's well measured. And then you have to think about what the trend is. And if you think about post and it's a fixed cost business, then volume increases boost productivity relatively easy. It was fabulous to be a postal manager before the year 2003, because that's when all of that changed and volumes went in a completely different direction. So whenever I've done international productivity measurements, comparisons between countries, United States, USPS always stands head and shoulders above the rest in terms of that productivity, which might be unit cost per letter delivered, for argument's sake. But that sort of is more impressive than it sounds more impressive than it really is, because it's phenomenal economies of scale that have been enjoyed here for many years. And the important question is the trend. Where's it all going to? How does it change year by year? What are the productivity growth targets that a company ought to have like this? And what does achieving them mean for work practices, for standards of service, for example, for levels of capital investment? How do you make all of that justification? Third defining dimension is about regulation. So, if we think about regulation, it was invented to protect consumers and markets. Postal regulation sometimes sounds like the opposite, especially in Europe. It's designed to protect the postal company. Real issue there. And I'm not at all convinced that protecting the post in the long run benefits either the economy or the customer. And I think it's a different topic. So we all use the terms heavy-handed and light-handed in relation to regulation. Well, in my view, the United States seems to wield a very big and heavy hand of regulation on the post. It's nobody's fault. I can look at Postcom people, if there are any here, and say, you're doing your job, you've got a specific requirement imposed by Congress, you're meeting that. I can look at the postal managers here and say, well, you're doing the best you can. You might grumble a little bit about regulation, but let's face it, secretly it also helps. It offers a little bit of sort of comfort. So it takes some pressure off. I can look at big customers and big competitors in the US today and say, well, they know keeping the status quo keeps the dinosaur, keeps the elephant, if you like, in the room under control. And I can look at the congressional committees that we see that are toying with the postal legislation, and they're doing their jobs because they haven't been elected to change things, particularly in the postal area. They've been elected to keep things exactly as they are. How many post offices, 6-day delivery, all that great traditional activities. As I reminded this conference a couple of years ago, I quoted your Thomas Jefferson, and I said, or he said rather, and I think it's fantastic, the coat made for the boy will not fit the man. So when you had an expression in your constitution that said something about the postal service and so on, he had it in mind. It was a boy we were talking about. It was a new country, or something was going to grow, things were going to change. The internet was going to be invented. He might have even thought about that. But, as I stand in front of you today and if I stand next to my own adult sons, I seem to be getting a lot smaller in comparison to them. And so I'm saying, well, maybe you don't have to worry so much about this coat because you might be able to start to shrink into it at some point. The fourth dimension I talked about was diversification. That's really about revenue growth and opportunity. What gives you the positive when you come to work every day. You think about where that can go, what more you can do, how you can stay relevant. It's the optimistic part of the business. And in fact, when I was a postal chief executive, I set myself targets about revenue growth as personal targets of achievement. But diversification doesn't solve all the problems. It carries you into new areas of expertise which could leave behind the other employees in the business, the core traditions and so on. I said to you before, I don't think we need more financial services in developed economies. So what are we bothering about banking and those types of services in post offices? My own background was I started a postal bank. It delivers 110% of New Zealand Post profitability today. What's that got to do with running the logistics of a postal activity? So I'm less certain about that as a direction for existing developed economies. So, you know, I think what our core business is, it is about logistics. It's moving things about in a complicated world, and I do think logistics runs the world. Without that, the smoothness of that, if we think of the future congestion that cities and freight areas are going to face, how to do that more efficiently and better, I think, is the important area to be in. So the last measure I had was commercial or the financial metrics. Most countries, you know, the 200 postal countries in the world, most of them have got a sort of quasi-company structure for the National Post Office. A few remain as government departments, but the evolution is fairly clear. Customers are more or less expected to pay for the service, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the postal business has to be profitable. That's something the owners can determine. That's their business. Where the owner is government, however, they do ask the impossible. I have had conversations with Postal Minister where the Minister said, I want to see a reformed, profitable, successful post. Here are the conditions. No price increases, because look at the poor consumer. No job losses. Look at what we owe our employees and security. Other than those things, go for it. And here in the US, I guess we could add, don't encroach on the private sector. But my point about talking on this topic is that the mandated conditions from government are just that. They're the rules of work in, the government sets it. The hard part is persuading government to change, showing them that they have to pay for it one way or another. And a subsidised postal business is perfectly reasonable. It fits in with government policy. And the important part for me is that we are clear about the cost of it. That's all. It's just, let's have the numbers are clear. Now, a very wealthy country I know, in fact the wealthiest country in the world on a per capita basis, they have internal labour laws that say if you're a national citizen, you must be paid a certain rate, you must have there are mandated allowances and so on, things that will triple the labour cost for a national citizen compared to, for example, an expat worker. So in that environment, I've coined a term, and I think it might be relevant here too. I've called it the national premium. It's a premium to employ a certain class of people or a citizen and so on and pay for them. But the question is, you can't expect the customer to pay for it, because in a competitive market, the other players don't fall under those particular rules. And so clarity of information will say, okay, the cost of the premium. And there is a premium, even here in the United States, to be a postal worker. The state should be expected to pay for that. So let's be clear about it. Anyway, that's a hobby horse that, you know, if once on top of that, you've lost your sort of timetable here, John. So I'm going to jump off that hobby horse and put some numbers in front of you. So I've rated. Let's see, how do we score the postal service? My rating system's 1 to 5. 1 is poor, 5 is good. I'm thinking about the world in general. I'd say on the governance, I've scored 2. Productivity, 3. Regulation, 2. Diversification, 2. Commercials, 3. It's a total of 12 out of 25. I don't think it's going to get you into Harvard, but you're on your way to fitting that coat. Thank you, John. Well, if anybody wants to ask a question, John's inviting you to do that, but I don't want to interrupt with your lunch. David.
Which one of those scores gave you the most difficult, and why?
Right. The most difficulty is depth of knowledge about exactly what's happening here. I've been following the USPS for many, many years, as you know. I've known a lot of Postmaster Generals and so on. And it was the specifics of maybe the productivity question, whether the rate of productivity growth and change is fast enough. It's been significant in this environment, but it's not been great compared to what's happened elsewhere. The others I felt honestly quite easy.
I have a question. Are you in favor of subsidy?
If the purpose is specific, that is, the clarity of the intent is there, it's not misguided or messed around. So in the UK, I said to you before, Royal Mail, I think it's £150 million a year to run a post office network, which is mainly all agency post offices anyway, right? So there is no way they are going to make the commercial grade. The minister still says, be profitable, I'm taking away the subsidy in 2 years' time. Now, in New Zealand, when the government said, we're taking your post office subsidy, which was very clearly enumerated away, we said, we will close 900 of the 1,200 post offices on the 14th of February, whatever year it was, a long time ago. There was a consequence. And the government has to sit there and say, right, that's the consequence. Am I prepared to pay that? Now, it's not in the US, the sums involved aren't enough. You know, so who's thinking about it? So I think subsidies are right if the government is clear what it's for, and there's no funny business in terms of juggling the money.
So you gave a score of 12, and so I'm still in the child's vest. What do I have to do to become in the man's vest?
To become in the?
To be able to wear the man's vest.
Yeah, to start growing into the coat.
Yeah.
Well, where's the noise that sort of makes these particular points clear? Certainly the national premium in terms of the health benefit costs and so on have become clear, and I think the state will say we're going to pay for it. Is there clarity about the argument on the costs and benefits of 6-day delivery, 5-day delivery and so on? You know, there's enough people have run the market research on all of that and so on, but the effort in persuading the stakeholders about these things, I think, requires some activity. And it would be better, I think, you'd go up the score. You know, the commercials, 3 out of 5, is very high on an international comparative basis. That's a good score. So the business is managing costs against revenues reasonably well. So I think that's a good score. The regulatory and governance requirements are in the hands of others. And a postal manager can't do anything about that except sort of make some noise about it, and it's not the job of the sort of, it's relatively few people who can make commentary about that. And so where are the, what do you call them here, the super PACs, or where are the groups who are arguing for postal change? Maybe it's not important. But you know, where are those lobby groups? You know, there's hundreds of millions of dollars of funding's being raised, I read in one of the papers, to think about your next justice appointment to the Supreme Court. You know, is there anyone interested in doing any of this? And it seems to me that the competitive environment's quite happy to keep the USPS where it is. I took 10 years to start the bank in a small country in New Zealand. You know, it is a long-term play, but it's not your fault. If you have these constraints here and you're clear on the implications of those in terms of your commercials or your performance and so on, then you know it's not a postal manager's fault, or it's not the regulator's official's fault. You know, it's a situation. And there's no noise about changing it, so people are happy with the status quo. So I'm saying that's what it is. It's a subsidy system.
Well,
Sorry, it is a hobby horse of mine.
Almost in a de facto sense. If you have, where's Laurie? Laurie, $121 billion in unfunded liabilities, and we still just keep going along. Is that not a subsidy? If if it continues. And then actually on the subsidy argument, when I started really thinking about this a few years ago, I said, hey, wait a minute, what about Amtrak? What about Amtrak? What's so bad about a subsidy? And now there's proposals to take that subsidy away from Amtrak and shut down rail service in some places. In this government, it's not a good time for subsidy,
No.
I'm afraid.
Right.
Anybody else? Yeah.
No, sorry.
Keelan.
Yeah, can you give us a comparison of how you think we're doing here in parcel delivery as opposed to some of the leading nations around the world? There's been
Right.
progress, of course, with the work share program. It shows that it works, but I'm not sure that the
Right.
postal service is actually getting the revenue.
Right. Now you've got me on another topic. First of all, the sole question I ask any postal business in parcels is how is your parcel growth compared to your market share, changing with the year? Right? So you go to Royal Mail, the parcels increased 2%, but it was a 10, 12% parcel volume growth. So it's all going to competitors. So that's the first question I ask you. The second question, is anyone here a large letter mailer representing the letter mailing industry? No? Well, the people who are sending the millions and millions and billions of letters, you are paying for the privilege of UPS and FedEx giving their suburban parcels to the USPS, right? Because the postal company, and I haven't spoken to any postal managers, but I've been a postal manager. It's marginal cost versus average cost. And the day average cost comes into the last mile delivery for a post, and that fixed cost, and that price goes to parcel delivery, then I think you're going to see the reality of the situation. So it's market share and what's the real cost. As long as you know it privately, you don't have to sort of tell the world about it.
Thank you, that was fantastic. And thank you. Well done.